This airplane lost control and plummeted approximately 38,000 feet in little over 4 minutes. A slice of bread takes about the same amount of time to toast. Which important elements led to this accident? Keep an eye out. On May 28, 2009, the crew that will operate aboard France Flight 447 arrived in Rio de Janeiro from Paris. Before the journey back to Paris, they were supposed to make a 3-day stay in Rio. We have very little information regarding their activities during this stopover, but we do know that the first officer, who would later be the flight's pilot, had brought his wife along. Considering that, it seems improbable that he slept for the whole day prior to the flight, and there were hints that this may also be the case for the other pilots. The departure time of Flight 447 was set at 8 p.m. Rio time. The crew would have to work through the night on the way home, with a planned arrival time in Paris around noon on June 1st, as it would be 11 p.m. Paris time. This would require the pilots to work during the window of circadian law, which is a period of the night when it is most difficult for the human body and mind to remain vigilant. Due to this and the fact that the journey was expected to run 12 hours and 45 minutes, an additional pilot was added to the flight crew in order to accommodate planned relaxation during the return flight. This indicated that a captain, 2 first officers, and 3 pilots would be flying together. The 58-year-old captain had 11,000 hours of overall flying experience, 1,700 of which were spent flying the Airbus A330 as a pilot. The crew's least experienced member, the 32-year-old first officer, had 3,000 total hours and 800 on the type. The year before to the flight, in 2008, he completed his type rating on the Airbus A330 and 340. The third pilot was a 37-year-old first officer, whom I shall call a relief pilot in this film. Despite having 6,500 hours in total, he was the most experienced pilot on the type, having flown 4,500 hours. Because he was also working as a management pilot, he had not done much flying in the 3 months before to the mission. Their facades. The pilots convened and went over the planning documents, such as weather forecasts, flight schedules, and note terms, before beginning the flights. The weather in Paris and on the way out was ideal, but the uncontrolled weather seemed to be a little trickier. The Intertropical Convergence Zone, or ITCZ, is a region over the Atlantic that would be traversed by the trip because it would be crossing the equator. The converging easterly trade winds from the northern and southern hemispheres in this area have the potential to push humid air from the sea's surface higher. Strong thunderstorms may result from this, with a maximum altitude of 60,000 feet, much higher than most airplanes can fly. This implies that planes that must fly through this area may have to fly in between, and sometimes even through, some of these storm clouds. Pilots must exercise extreme caution while navigating near storms that originate over sea in the ITCZ because they might sometimes have a lower water content than storms that form over land, making them more difficult to discern on the aircraft's weather radar. Because they could still be really bad. The pilots probably spoke about the possibility of running into these kinds of storms and brought along a little extra fuel so they could avoid them if necessary. Additionally, the pilots informed their 9 cabin crew members of the potential for turbulence and how it may impact their service. We must briefly address the kinds of precipitation that occur within these kinds of thunderstorms before moving on from the topic of the Intertropical Convergence Zone. As you look higher up into the clouds, things may become a little more confusing, but most people are acquainted with the heavy rain and sometimes hail that usually come out of these clouds. The cloud's very powerful currents have the ability to push water droplets upward into extremely cold air, causing them to become supercooled. This indicates that they are still in water form, but they will immediately freeze and become clear ice as soon as they come into contact with any kind of surface. a kind of soft ice crystals, which are not as hard as hail, but large enough to be audible when they strike an airplane if you fly through it, may sometimes develop when these really cool droplets combine with snowflakes. Although it doesn't produce the same kind of severe airframe icing as super cold rain, this kind of precipitation has a large volume and may rapidly overwhelm and block the aircraft's sensors and probes, particularly the PITANIC probes, which I will discuss later. In 2008 and 2009, there were over 9 reports of this kind of clogging occurring on Air France flights. These reports, along with instructions on how to identify and address the problems, were published in a safety bulletin that was distributed to all Air France pilots the year prior to the accident flight. The pilots were to fly an Airbus A300 and 3203, which was a very new aircraft. On the night of the departure, it was in almost flawless operating condition, having been delivered to Air France in 2005. The pilots requested 70.4 tons of fuel to be loaded before they arrived at the aircraft, and then they went out to the aircraft with their cabin crew and began getting it ready for takeoff. It will be hard to describe what transpired on this journey without also providing some information about this Airbus and a brief overview of flying in general. Since the quantity of air flowing over the wings is what really affects the aircraft's performance, pilots require a technique to monitor it precisely. They do this by using a particular kind of probe called a pitot tube or PITA probe. These probes, which resemble rifle barrels, are often located under the cockpit along the front of the aircraft. The air enters via a hole at the front, and the tube's internal pressure is then measured. The Airbus A330 has automated heating that is powered by electricity. However, the static pressure must also be monitored in order to subtract it from the total pressure obtained from the PITA probes in order to determine the airspeed properly. A separate device known as a static port is used to detect this static pressure, which is then utilized to determine the aircraft's altitude and, more importantly, its airspeed. The aircraft's computers, known as Air Data Modules or ADMs, receive these various pressures after then. The actual real airspeed will be determined by the ADMs, but another crucial aspect of this narrative is that, depending on the aircraft's speed, the static pressure from the static port has to be adjusted. This is because, depending on the speed, the air will produce localized pressure changes as it flows over the aircraft surfaces around the static port. 3 separate independent sets of sensors and computers are installed on the aircraft since airspeed and altitude are crucial quantities. The ADM computers do these modifications automatically. Airbus has already begun investigating the issue after Air France and other operators reported issues with ice crystals obstructing the PITA probes. Issue: a maintenance advisory recommending an update to these more recent PITA probes was published when it was discovered that they were more successful in averting these issues. About a month before Flight 447 took off, Air France had begun updating their first Airbus A330, and the disaster aircraft was originally supposed to have its probes replaced when it arrived in Paris after the voyage. However, why was the modification of these PITA probes only a recommended course of action? Why wasn't it required? That's because the pilots were expected to follow a specified process in the event that the problem caused a temporary loss of airspeed, which was very uncommon and only lasted for a few minutes at most. This process was called IST2s in Air France, but I'll call it unstable airspeed for the sake of this article. Due to many reports, this issue was included into the regular training scenario for all Air France crews in 2008 and 2009. Airspeed unreliable exercises had been part of the training, but only at low altitude. This is because the aircraft's performance was far greater than it would be at high altitude, but it was also thought to be more safety crucial due to its proximity to the land. Diagnosing airspeed instability may be challenging since the reason and severity of the failure will determine how it appears. When the malfunction happened, no warnings were audible in the cockpit, and the autopilot did not detach during the exercises that the Air France personnel had conducted. Memory items, or safety-critical tasks that had to be completed immediately from the pilot's memory, were now a part of the airspeed unreliable process. However, their use was discretionary according on the circumstances, and it was thought to be necessary. Additionally, they conducted all of their initial training at low altitude, with a strong focus on using propulsion to force the aircraft out of the stall and recover it with the least amount of height lost. The second thing to do was to lower the pitch. The notion that the engines would be powerful enough to remove an airplane from a very high angle of attack will now also become crucial. At 22:09 UTC, only 9 minutes behind schedule, the pilots requested pushback and began to depart from their gate once the 216 passengers had completed boarding and the crew was prepared. All 3 pilots were in the cockpit for the taxi out, and his officer was pilot flying. The aircraft began rolling down the Rio de Janeiro runway at time 22:29 and executed a fully typical takeoff. Following their well-defined escape route, they ascended along a northeasterly path that followed the Brazilian coastline. The replacement pilot exited the cockpit to begin his 3-hour rest time, which was supposed to begin after rising 20,000 feet. Since the audio recordings from the cockpit voice recorder don't begin until well after midnight UTC time, we are unsure of the precise moment he departed the cockpit. He returned to the crew rest compartment, which was made up of 2 bunk beds directly behind the cockpit. Regardless, the 2 surviving pilots were given permission to ascend to their initial cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. While they were assembling crews, they spoke with controllers from Brasilia Fire before switching to receive control. Since they were mostly still flying over land in that control area, receiver control would be the last to have radar contact with the flight. However, as they entered the next fire, Atlantico, they would leave radar coverage and begin adhering to oceanic traffic separation protocols. Nowadays, certain training protocols and aircraft equipment are needed for flying over maritime regions. Aircraft are outfitted with HF radios since VHF radio transmission is difficult due to the Earth's curvature. These radios can go significantly further because they employ ionosphere layers to bounce the signals off of. The pilots used one of the 2 HF frequencies they were allowed to check in with Atlantico Control when the aircraft passed an RNAV station known as INTOL. The pilots then attempted to use ADS-C, a new technology that was being tested in the region at the time. This system would update the aircraft's position to ADS-C using automated reports supplied by the aircraft itself via satellite, indicating its location even in the absence of radar coverage. The ability of this new technology to instantly submit a report in the event that an aircraft departed from the designated path or altitude was another wonderful feature. However, the pilots were unable to use this new system because of a formatting problem in the submitted flight plan, which meant that the aircraft could no longer be precisely monitored as soon as it departed conventional radar coverage. Anything that would eventually have serious repercussions. Being a fly-by-wire aircraft, the Airbus A330 uses a computer to electronically analyze the pilot's inputs on the rudders and side stick before sending them to the hydraulic flight control actuators for execution. Although this kind of control has several advantages, such as making the aircraft much lighter, its primary function is to enable the aircraft to monitor certain safety limits and ensure that they are not exceeded. In addition to protecting the maximum and minimum speeds, a plethora of other factors are also checked, such as excessive bank and pitch angles. Now, the system's tractors claim that this gives the aircraft the last word from the pilots, but that isn't quite accurate. The fly-by-wire technology does need pilots to have a thorough understanding of how it operates and when the safeguards do and do not function. But it only blocks moves that are very extreme and ultimately deadly. This is obviously true for any airplanes, but it's particularly true in this case. What's the reason for that? The computers that keep an eye on these safeguards must make certain that they are initially utilizing the right settings in order for them to function as intended. Because they don't fully understand what's happening, the computers will back off and remove those safeguards if that isn't the case. Numerous sources, including PDUP probes, static ports, inertial reference units, angle of attack vanes, and more provide input to these computers. The Air Data Inertial Reference System is made up of 3 air data reference units that integrate all of this data. The aircraft control computers may continue to function according to what is known as normal law as long as all 3, or at least 2, of these ADRs are in agreement with one another. According to normal law, all safeguards are in place, and it is almost impossible for an airplane to stall or get upset. However, 2 things will happen very fast if 2 or more ADRs begin providing odd information. Initially, these discrepancies may impact the external flying system, such as the outside pilot who steers the aircraft, the outer throttle that regulates the engines, and the flight directors who instruct the pilots. It makes perfect sense when you consider it. If the aircraft is unsure of what is happening, it will not attempt to maneuver or operate the aircraft. That will be up to the pilots to choose. According to the same reasoning, the aircraft control computers will switch from standard law to alternative law 1 or 2, depending on how serious the problems are. The precautions that the aircraft typically has in terms of maximum angle of attack or stall prevention will no longer be accessible, which is the difference between regular law and alternative law 2, which will soon become applicable in this trip. This will be shown by the elimination of warning indications that would typically indicate restrictions, such as the barber's pole on the main flight display and yellow crosses. Another distinction is that the aircraft's roll control is altered. The roll inputs on the side stick will instruct the aircraft to perform a certain roll rate in both standard law and alternative law. The aircraft will correct for gust disruptions and maintain the specified duty rate if the pilot enters it. In essence, it will be highly manageable and stable. However, instead of directing a certain roll rate in alternative load 2, the side stick will provide direct orders to the spoilers and ailerons. This implies that there are no stability controls or bank safeguards. Additionally, because of the thinner air at higher altitudes, where there is less aerodynamic dampening, the aircraft will become more sensitive to roll. The pitch trim mechanism is another significant distinction between an Airbus fly-by-wire aircraft and a regular aircraft. In a traditional aircraft, the yoke directly controls the flight controls while flying manually, and the pilots must intentionally adjust the trim. The side stick input on an Airbus will request a pitch or G loading vertically and a certain roll rate horizontally from the control computers. The elevators will start the pitch when the pilot selects a certain pitch, and the enormous horizontal stabilizer will move on its own to keep the pitch constant without the pilot's participation. This also implies that, unlike other aircraft, such as the 737, there is no significant tactile input from the stick if the aircraft is, for instance, into a peculiar trim position because of low speed. Now that they were on their way, Flight 447 got a communication from their business alerting them of the reported thunderstorm activity. Further ahead, the first officer began discussing some buildups he could see ahead of them after switching the scale on his navigation display. The pilots then began talking about how they may be able to escape the turbulence that these clouds would bring. The first officer expressed his concern about the storm clouds that he could see approaching. The first officer verified that the aircraft was now approaching a cloud layer at 146 by turning down the cockpit lights to improve visibility outside. Outside, it was completely dark, the moon was behind them, and the plane was now being rocked by less turbulence. At the light of a 350, it seemed as if they were just skimming the tops of the clouds, so the crew debated whether it would be feasible to rise higher. However, when the first officer looked up the highest height they could reach, it was FL 370. They both agreed that it wouldn't be wise to sit at the highest altitude in case the turbulence worsened. This is perhaps an excellent time to talk about anything else that may soon become significant. The outer air will become thinner and thinner as an airplane rises higher. As a result, depending on the aircraft's weight, external temperature, and other variables, the engines simply won't be able to generate enough additional push to allow the aircraft to continue climbing. This also implies that the engines have little spare force to handle any abnormalities up there. So pilots like us must fly the aircraft with extreme caution and conservatism. An airplane can only ascend over its stated maximum height by exchanging kinetic energy, or speed, for potential energy or altitude. However, this would significantly increase the angle of attack. Because of the aerodynamic consequences of flying closer to the speed of sound, the critical angle of attack, the angle at which the aircraft would stall if it succeeded, is also less at higher altitudes. In other words, at higher altitudes, the aircraft will have less available power and stall early. Because there would be less air to provide aerodynamic dampening, it will also be more sensitive and more difficult to hand fly. The pilot began making remarks on the look of street after the plane had gone into the clouds. Elmos are flammable. This further suggests that they were approaching storm clouds and is a clear indicator of a growing electrical charge near an aircraft. At this point, the call bell in the crew bunk behind the cockpit was triggered by the captain pressing a button on the overhead panel. In order to allow the captain to retire to the bed and relax, this was intended to alert the relief pilot when it was time for him to take over in the cockpit. To indicate that he had heard the bell, the relief pilot pounded on the wall of the cockpit. Unless otherwise agreed, the air front's regular operating procedures at the time required that when the captain went to rest, the first officer in the right seat, who was pilot flying, would assume the job of piloting command. This is precisely what transpired in this instance, and the captain got up from his seat to listen to the briefing that the first officer gave the replacement pilot when he arrived in the cockpit at 1:59. This briefing included the expected turbulence, the fact that they were now flying in clouds, and the fact that they were currently unable to go much higher. The captain departed the cockpit to begin his slumber, leaving no explicit instructions for the two first officers on how to handle the upcoming thunderstorms. We can only guess now as to why he didn't provide more precise directions. Since all three pilots had flown this route several times and were used to this kind of weather, as I previously said, he probably thought the two first officers could handle it just fine. According to Air France protocols, the first officer continued to fly and effectively pilot command after the captain departed, while a far more experienced relieving pilot assumed the duty of pilot monitoring in the left seat. The first officer brought up the intertropical convergence zone as the two pilots began talking about the weather conditions ahead. However, at this point, there was no talk of attempting to steer clear of the cells. The replacement pilot said that he had just fallen asleep for a little while when the first officer inquired whether he had been able to sleep at all. The first officer was then questioned by the relieving pilot whether he was feeling okay. The two pilots may be feeling a little worn out at this point, based on their conversation. Earlier, the skipper had also said some similar things. Additionally, when the relief pilot sat down, he did not move his pilot chair forward into the piloting position, leaving it in the aft position. That probably would have allowed him to put his feet up in a more comfortable position, but it wouldn't be ideal if he had to fly the plane out of the blue, which he would soon have to do. The first officer alerted the cabin crew to the impending minor turbulence and warned them to exercise caution at 0 to 2, 0 to 6, and 5-second intervals. About 4 minutes had passed since the captain had left the cockpit, and the emergency procedure would start in 4 more minutes. Now that he was examining his navigation display more closely, the relief pilot reached down and set his weather radar's gain to maximum. This emphasized the weather in front of them and increased the sensitivity of the weather radar. He then expressed some unease with what he was seeing in front of them by asking the first officer if he would want to move slightly to the left. He pointed to the return on the screen in front of them and asked again whether they may turn left when the first officer inquired what he meant. After agreeing, the first officer swung the heading book to the left by roughly 12 degrees. They abandoned their flight plan path and did not attempt to radio this modification to traffic control, which was a rather minor adjustment considering the amount of weather they had ahead of them. The speech recorder in the cockpit detected a shift in the background noise at 0.2, 0.8, and 17 seconds. The sound like raindrops striking the cockpit. When the first officer saw that the temperature was rising, he inquired as to whether the relief pilot had adjusted the air conditioning. "What's that smell?" he inquired. After identifying the odor as ozone, the relief pilot reassured his colleague by describing what ozone was: the precipitation outside the airplane, and these remarks were indicators of the kind of weather event the aircraft was presently experiencing. Another indication that massive volumes of water or ice were being abruptly drawn into the engines and partly overpowering the air conditioning system was the shift in temperature and humidity that was noticed in the cockpit. The background noise became louder and shifted to the sound of ice crystals striking the cockpit 20 seconds later. The first officer lowered the required speed from max 0.82 to 0.8, the turbulence penetration speed, as the turbulence increased. The outer throttle lowered the thrust to 84% and 1% as a result. The plane had been operating perfectly up until this point, and the two pilots were at ease and just keeping an eye on the outer pilot as it went about its duties. Although the exact reason is unknown, it is quite probable that the ice crystals that were now bombarding the aircraft outside began to overcome the PITANIC probe's heating components, which were giving the three air data modules vital information. The outside pilot and outer throttle abruptly detached at 0.02, 0.05, and 0.05 seconds, accompanied by the corresponding cavalry charge warning in the cockpit. Simultaneously, the aircraft began to bank significantly to the right due to a strong wind gust. The first cop grabbed his side stick and said, "I have controls." Both pilots would have been severely startled by the abrupt initiation of warnings and aircraft behavior, and confusion would have set in almost instantly. However, at this moment, just this right bank was forming, and the airplane was still flying quite level. The airspeed on the standby indicator and the captain's main flight display abruptly decreased from 275 miles per hour to 60 knots as the aircraft continued to bank right, which was obviously incorrect. The first officer's instruments probably plummeted with a comparable amount, but we are unsure of what they displayed since they were not captured on the flight data recorder. Do you recall how the altimeter system adjusted the pressure to get greater Mach numbers? The altimeter system recalculated its altitude and abruptly displayed a 300-foot drop and a negative vertical speed since the speed was now seen as being much lower. After being abruptly thrust into control of the aircraft, the first officer reflexively gave the left aileron and pitched up to adjust the aircraft's height. The series of events that would eventually bring this flight to an end began at this point. The aircraft returned to alternative law, which meant that the angle of attack safeguards, overspeed, and bank protections were all gone since all three ADRs were now displaying faulty data. The first officer had to focus really hard to get the aircraft to cease banking and return to level flight since, as I previously said, the roll control had also become about twice as sensitive. He began overcorrecting, and his side stick motions began to produce additional oscillations that went from right to left and back again. The first officer may have focused most of his attention on this aspect of the handling at this time, but keep in mind that he had also begun pitching up. Now that pitch was rising, resulting in an extremely rapid rate of ascent. A short stall warning was also audible in the cockpit almost immediately after the autopilot disengaged and all the other alerts began. The replacement pilot cried out, "What is that?" when the alert sounded, most likely as a result of the warning's urgency, although it can also suggest that its meaning is unclear. Due to a lack of trustworthy data, the command bars vanished even though the crew did not disconnect the flight directors as directed by the airspeed unreliable procedure. The aircraft's pitch had reached 11 degrees nose up 11 seconds into the sequence, and the first officer was still overcorrecting while using the maximum amount of left and right stick input. He also phoned and said, "We don't have a good display," perhaps in reference to the absence of speed information. "We've lost the speeds and alternate low protection low," said the relief pilot, who was in charge of the ECAM alerts and the non-normal checklist. He then proceeded to read out the ICAM messages, albeit in a hurried and difficult-to-understand way, emphasizing that the aircraft was operating under alternative legislation, which meant that it would operate differently and that certain safeguards were removed would have been vital in this situation. He said that the first officer asked the engine lever in response to the loss of outside thrust, indicating some misunderstanding of the relief pilot's words. The thrust had entered a condition known as engine thrust locked, which essentially indicated that it was maintaining its previously chosen value of 84%, since the outer throttle had disengaged at the time of the incident. In order to restore thrust control, ICAM told the crew to manually move the thrust lever. However, the first officer pressed the outside problem disconnect button, leaving the thrust lever in the climb detent. And as a result, the thrust began to grow into greater thrust. The first 18 seconds of this catastrophe included everything I have just said. Each of the 10 distinct ICAM messages that appeared caused the cockpit to ring. Moreover, a continuous C-chord chime and the illumination of the master warning and master caution lights in front of the pilots signaled that the aircraft had departed its clear height. For the pilots, this would have been a highly perplexing and frightening situation. Additionally, the pilots may not have started carrying out that method since the ICAM did not display inconsistent airspeed. Instead, they had to figure it out on their own. The moment. The aircraft's pitch-up attitude had reached 12 degrees nose-up at times 0 to 10 and 26 seconds. As it crossed 36,000 feet, the plane was suddenly ascending at a hair-racing 6,900 feet per minute, which was more than 7 times faster than it would normally be. The airplane was now quickly trading speeds for height in order to maintain this high rate. The flight director bars abruptly reappeared in front of the first officer, but this time they were in vertical speed mode since they had triggered during a climb, rather than the altitude hold settings. As a result, the flight directors were now beginning to demonstrate to the pilots the pitch required to sustain their present rise of 6,000 feet per minute. Given that the first cop was probably becoming more overwhelmed by his job and knows that would have been of little use in this case. This was the exact reason why shutting off the flight directors was one of the unreliable airspeed memory entries. The relief pilot reached to turn on the wing anti-ice and turned his attention away from the ICAM display, which he had already stopped viewing. At that moment, he became aware of the aircraft's steep pitch. Since the speed indicator hadn't come back, he cried out, "What's your speed?" Maybe alluding to the vertical speed. The first officer began tilting forward, but not quite enough, and said, Okay, I'm going back down." The airplane kept climbing even though this just slowed the rate of ascent. The first officer said, "Okay," in response to the replacement pilot's repeated calls for him to stabilize and descend again. "You're going up, so go back down," the 3 officers said. Now that the pitch had temporarily decreased to roughly 10 degrees pitch out, the climb rate was still over 4,000 feet per minute. As they ascended to their estimated maximum altitude of 37,000 feet, the flight directors vanished once again between 0 and 10 and 36 seconds, but the airspeed returned. On the left, showing 223 knots as the proper speed. This indicated that the aircraft had lost around 15 knots of pressure to airspeed up to this point, and the speed was still decreasing. Once again, the flight directors briefly flashed up, vanished, and then reappeared, directing the aircraft to rise at a rate of around 1,400 feet per minute, which is exactly what it was doing at the moment. The first officer mysteriously decreased the push back to around 85% and prevailed at time 0 to 10 and 47 seconds, which is probably an indication of his growing confusion and lack of situational awareness. In an attempt to bring the captain back in the cockpit, the substitute pilot pressed the call button. "Where is he?" he said, pressing it many times. Additionally, he reached over and turned on the attitude heading selection and the air data selector for the first officer on 3. These switches, which were not on any checklists, are made to alter the data input for the displays. He probably changed them in an effort to fix the instrument he believed the first officer was missing. The cockpit's stall alert went out 3 seconds later and continued to sound nonstop for the following 45 seconds. None of the pilots expressed or even mentioned that this alert was now continually playing. Rather, the first officer responded by reversing the settings, which raised the pitch attitude to 16 degrees, nose up, as it would be during takeoff. A possible recovery became much more difficult as a result of this pitch-up instruction, which also caused the aircraft's rear stabilizer to begin shifting into the maximum nose-up position. At this point, the aircraft's energy was insufficient to maintain the desired climb rate. Rather, it began to gradually level out and rock from side to side, which the first officer frantically attempted to stop with the side stick. At this point, they were swiftly approaching a fully fledged stall. A stall occurs when an aircraft wing moves beyond its critical angle of attack, which means that it can no longer generate lift and will instead begin to descend. Any attitude might result in a standstill. The angle of attack, which is the angle formed between the wing chord line and the incoming airflow, is the single factor that controls when it occurs. Both pilots would never have had the sensation of a fully developed stall in the actual aircraft, despite having received early instruction on how to handle an approach to stall and recovery during the type ratings years earlier. One of the first things that goes away when a person is under stress is their hearing. Therefore, the fact that the Airbus only has an auditory warning rather than a visible stall indicator in front of the pilots or a stick shaker may also have contributed to the reason why the warning went unheeded. The aircraft hit its stall angle of attack at times 0 to 2, 10, and 57 seconds, at which point it began to shake violently from buffeting. Compared to turbulence, this kind of buffeting occurs far more often and has a totally different sensation. Although it was the first officer to apply full toga thrust, the Indians were unable to generate enough power to even maintain the speed, much less accelerate it, at this height above the aircraft's maximum performance altitude. The first officer kept making maximum left and right inputs, thus the relief pilot's cry to try to touch the lateral controls as little as possible, which showed some understanding of the difficulties of flying in alternative law, was ignored. In reference to the captain, the substitute pilot also asked whether he was coming or not. Now the first cop shouted, "I'm in toga," alluding to the fact that he had added trust, which he may have believed would be sufficient to resolve the issue. After reaching its highest recorded height of 37,924 feet, the aircraft continued to ascend for a few hundred more feet before beginning to descend into the sea below. You may now wonder why the relief pilot didn't just take over. He requested modifications that were never made. We'll never know the answer, but it probably has to do with how quickly everything transpired. This was accomplished in around a minute. It was also challenging to keep an eye on what his colleague was doing since he was unable to see or feel the input he was making on the side stick because they aren't linked in the Airbus. After the heating elements had removed the remaining ice from the pitot tubes at periods 0 to 11 and 7 seconds, the standby and left airspeed indicators once again began to function. They had lost around 90 knots of velocity, as shown by the speed indicator, which read 183 knots. The stall signal continued to ring as the airplane began to descend at an ever-increasing rate. "But we've got the engines. What's going on?" the replacement pilot yelled out. "Do you comprehend what's going on after that?" But he received no response. The first officer gave constant left side stick as the aircraft began banking over to the right, but it had very little impact. For the following 40 seconds, the first officer would likewise keep using his side stick to provide the pitch-up instruction. Now, there are a few things to consider for everyone who is still in shock about how the first officer could have reacted in this manner. The first is that when under stress, the human brain does not function effectively, and we have a tendency to fall back on our training. This leads me to my second concern, which is the operation of the Airbus under typical flight conditions. As you can see, using constant back pressure and toga thrust will give you the finest climb performance the airplane can provide. For instance, it will pitch to stay near its maximum angle of attack while utilizing maximum power to provide the optimum performance during a wind shear or terrain escape maneuver, since the aircraft will not let it to stall. However, that only functions under regular legislation. The acts of the overworked first officer may seem somewhat more comprehensible if you use that reasoning. When the first officer called out that he had lost complete control of the aircraft, it was at 0 to 11 and 32 seconds. Although he never publicly stated that takeover, the relief pilot replied by stating controls to the left and pressing the takeover button to assume over. Before the first officer regained control and proceeded with his own inputs, aft and left, none of which were functioning, he made 2 quick inputs to the left of his own controls. The aircraft was now more likely to fall and fly because its angle of attack was over 40 degrees and its drop rate had climbed to around 10,000 feet per minute. The air was now striking the aircraft from below at a 40 to 60 degree angle because it was keeping such an extraordinarily high angle of attack. In addition to creating an odd wind noise in the cockpit, this was also important since the angle at which the air was striking the pitot tubes and the static board width had increased to such an extent that the pressure on both was almost identical. As a result, the speed indicator vanished once again as the computer considered the circumstances to be wholly unfeasible and untrustworthy. Therefore, ice had nothing to do with the crew's current situation, where they were once again without a meaningful speed indicator. Only their dire aircraft circumstances were to blame. Because such a speed could only be met on the ground, the onboard computers instructed the stall warning system to ignore the angle of attack vanes outside once the speed number fell below 60 knots. As a result, the stall warning in the cockpit stopped, and speed flags took its place on the pilot display when the predicted speed dropped below 30 knots. The first officer also made a statement at this time that provides some insight into why he was behaving in this manner. "My opinion is that we have the speed," he remarked. It's unclear what he was basing this sensation on, but it may have been his senses combined with the groaning outside wind noise and perhaps the buffeting he was experiencing. In any event, at times 0 to 11 and 42 seconds, the captain returned to the cockpit at the same moment as the stall warning was silenced. That was less than a minute after he was summoned back, and perhaps a minute and a half after the outer pilot disengaged. The sight before him was utterly surreal. The aircraft was dropping at an amazing vertical speed, and they were just beyond 35,000 feet, the same level they had maintained when he left the cockpit. But there was no stall warning at this time for the reason I just described. He saw 10 distinct ECAM alerts, master warning lights, and extreme buffeting that was causing the aircraft to shake. The pitch attitude was fluctuating between 15 degrees nose up and 9 degrees nose down. "What are you doing?" inquired the captain. The replacement pilot frantically replied, "What's going on?" "Well, I'm not sure. I had no idea what's going on. We're losing control of the aircraft here," the first officer continued, "and we've lost all control of the airplane," the relief pilot added. "Nothing is understood by us. We've tried everything." The aircraft eventually pitched down to around 11 degrees below the horizon as a result of the first officer's reduction of the engines to idle and their location under the wings. "I have a problem," remarked the first officer. "The reason is that I lack vertical speed. I've run out of displays. We don't have any reliable signs," the rescue pilot said. At this time, the vertical speed indicator may have been showing full down, or it may have been absent since the computer deemed any figure more than 20,000 feet per minute to be invalid. However, the pace began to increase and the angle of attack somewhat decreased since they were finally pitched down. However, in a terrible turn of events, the stall warning system once again recognized that it had legitimate indicators and began to sound, which had the bizarre consequence of signaling a stall while the nose was pitching down and going away when it was pitched back up. This happened because the speed had now begun to increase. The pilots must have been quite perplexed by this, Yet it was entirely consistent with the aircraft system design at the time, since no aircraft was ever supposed to approach the type of predicament they were in. "It seems to me that we are moving at a ridiculous pace," the first officer stated. "What are your thoughts?" When he reached over and applied the speed brake, his coworkers instructed him to stall it again right away. This also suggests that the first officer did, in fact, believe the aircraft was traveling too fast rather than in the fully formed stall that it was. The aircraft was dropping at a rate of 10,000 to 15,000 feet per minute as the nose oscillated between 8 degrees north down and 15 degrees north up while the pilots attempted to troubleshoot. The stall warning would sound each time it pitched down. Then it would silent when it pitched up again. It's probable that the yaw damper, which controlled the rudder and maintained the aircraft in a spin, was mostly responsible for the bank angle, which ranged between 20 and 40 degrees to the right. The thrust was once again pushed into the climb detent at times 0 to 2, 12, and 10 seconds. 20 seconds later, the aircraft ceased banking to the right and began oscillating left and right, which the first officer kept trying to control with his side stick. "What do you think?" the replacement pilot questioned the captain. "What must we accomplish?" However, the captain was utterly confused since he had not been told about the nature of the original breakdown or the quick ascent at the start of the emergency. "There, I don't know. There it's going down," was his response. Obviously was attempting to get his bearings from what he was seeing on the various instruments. All three pilots make many confusing callouts in the seconds that follow. "Am I going down now?" was one of the questions posed by the first officer remaining in command. The captain said, "No, you're inclined there," while the replacement pilot replied, "Go down." He was probably talking about his pitch attitude rather than the actual actions of the airplane. The first officer really puts the side stick completely forward for a little period of time at this point. The first officer verifies that the engines are in toga as a result of the pitch down and speed increase that follows. The stall alert then reappears. This demonstrates once again that this is his preferred reaction to the stall warning. "What do we have on Alti?" he questioned, referring to the altimeter measurement, which at this time was about 20,000 feet. This is a little odd since he should be able to see his altitude in front of him, but because the flight data recorder didn't record it, we are unable to confirm if the first officer had any functional instruments in front of him at all. It seems that he did have it based on subsequent analyses of the various computer failure mechanisms. "It's impossible," the captain said, indicating that he was still unable to understand what was happening. The pilots continued talking about the aircraft's attitude and how to bring the wings horizontal in the seconds that followed. Listening to the evident uncertainty is painful. After the first officer clarified that he was using raw controls to the maximum, the captain proposed that he attempt to halt the right back by using some left rudder. The plane briefly seemed to benefit from this as it rolled slightly to the left before continuing to bank right. The first officer yelled, "We're there, we're passing level 100," as the plane rose past 10,000 feet. The pilots probably had very little left to do to salvage this aircraft at this time. However, the relief pilot said, "Wait, I have controls," and then began making left inputs. The first officer, however, refused to relinquish control. Thus, the dual input warning was heard many times over the next several seconds. When the first officer yelled, "What is it? Why are we still going down?" the relief pilot told the captain to attempt to reset the flight control computers, which he did, but the captain also said that it wouldn't help. The first officer answered as the relief pilot began to yell, "Climb, climb, climb." "But I've been at max nose up for a while." The captain probably realized what was happening after hearing that last comment and yelled, "No, no, don't climb." The first officer was still holding his side stick backwards when the relieving pilot commanded to go down and moved it forward, resulting in a fresh dual input warning. Since the two inputs were now averaged, nothing occurred. "Give me the controls, give me the controls," the relief pilot said. The first officer said, "Go ahead, you have the nose and the controls. We're still in toga." Was now dropped 7 degrees below the horizon, and another stolen warning appeared on the speed indicator. The first officer began pulling back on the controls again 7 seconds after handing them over to the relief pilot, resulting in another dual input alarm. Additionally, the thrust levels were briefly withdrawn to idle before proceeding once again, perhaps in an attempt to bring about some kind of change. The relief pilot apparently changed his mind about the strategy after the captain called out from watch, "You're pitching up there." He said, "I'm pitching up. I'm pitching up." And when the captain continued to warn about doing so, he replied, "We need to do it. We're at 4,000 feet. The GPS system screaming out, "Great pull-up," as the plane plummeted 2,500 feet was the next sound captured by the cockpit voice recorder. At this moment, the speed was 107 knots forward, and the captain changed his mind as well. He cried out, "Go on pull," and the first officer responded, "Let's go pull up, pull up, pull up." Both pilots immediately drew as far back on their side sticks as possible, which caused the nose to pitch up 16 degrees beyond the horizon. 107 knots downhill, but equally heartbreaking. From 0 to 14 and 22 seconds, the first officer pressed his takeover button once more and held it there, locking out the relief pilot's control. The synthetic cockpit voice recorder called out priority, and the first officer pulled in panic, screaming, "Damn, we're going to crash," followed by, "This can't be true, what's happening?" While the stall and GPS warnings were blaring in the background, the captain yelled an order for the relief pilot to pitch forward for the final time. However, because the first officer was holding the takeover button, his inputs had no effect, and even if they had, it would have been too late to change the situation. The Airbus 330 crashed into the Atlantic Ocean at a 45-degree angle and at a vertical speed of 10,900 feet per minute. The forces applied to the airframe were equivalent to someone being dropped from the 46th floor of a building straight into the ground, shattering the aircraft into thousands of pieces, leaving the 228 people on board completely unaware of the aircraft's terrible fate. The 4 control centers that were supposed to be in contact with the flight soon began phoning each other to see if anyone had heard anything from the aircraft. The crew hadn't signed in at the different position checkpoints as required, and it quickly became apparent that there had been no indication from the airplane from time Sir 135 as well. For the first several hours, nobody paid much attention to this, since the issue with HF radio communication was not unusual in this region of the Atlantic Ocean. The various ATC centers kept making calls to check whether anything had been heard, and other planes on the same route were urged to attempt, but were unable to get in touch with the flight. This also applied to attempts to reach them by ACARS communications from Air France and SATCOM, a kind of satellite telephone. The aircraft was first reported missing 3 hours after the disaster, and 3 hours later, Madrid, Spain, and Senegalese ATC control centers sent out the first emergency alert. As a result, the first search and rescue aircraft were sent in the direction of the aircraft's last known position. The first floating debris was seen on the water surface on June 2, 2009, 2 days after the disaster. 3 days later, the first wreckage and casualties were retrieved from the ocean. This marked the start of a 2-year search and rescue operation that included mapping the whole underwater landscape in the region where the plane was believed to have crashed. The search was broken up into multiple campaigns, the most recent of which began in March 2011. On April 2nd of that year, the wreckage was eventually found on a comparatively level area of the seafloor at a depth of roughly 12,800 feet and 6.5 miles from its last position as reported by ACARS. This made it possible to retrieve thousands of parts, including the flight data recorder and the voice recorder in the cockpit, both of which were amazingly intact. What ultimately resulted in the final report and the information I just gave you was the discovery of both recorders. What were the findings of the final report then? What really caused this terrible accident? In actuality, nothing aboard the aircraft failed, but the pitot tubes and their heating components were momentarily overloaded by outside forces that probably exceeded their approved capabilities. The operating crew was severely startled as a result of the loss of dependable airspeed, which in turn triggered a series of alerts and autopilot disconnections about temporary system breakdown. The method for unreliable airspeed was supposed to be applied by the crew, but they never did. Rather, the flying pilot's first pitch-up response resulted in a steadily deteriorating energy condition, which the pilot monitoring later revealed. The aircraft left the flying performance envelope and entered a prolonged stall as a result of the following adjustments being insufficient. The pilot was unaware of this reality, perhaps due to a lack of training, but it's also possible that they believed the warning was false since it didn't fit their mental image of what was happening. In any event, the pilots never mentioned or articulated this stall state during the whole incident. Due to the stall's lack of identification, the crew never took any action to combat it. A comprehensive upset prevention and recovery technique training module for all pilots worldwide is one of the safety recommendations that resulted from this tragedy, which rocked the aviation industry. This covered stall recoveries and the impact of flying at high altitudes. In order to keep the airplane flying safely before beginning any troubleshooting, it also led to the creation of new memory items for flights with unpredictable airspeed. These items now center on turning off automatics and quickly adjusting pitch and power. Along with numerous other suggestions including the pitot probes, black boxes, the Airbus stall warning system, and search and rescue enhancements, the inquiry also suggested installing a camera in the cockpit to display all instrument indications. Although a number of other suggestions were also made, the most crucial lesson for pilots to learn from this disaster is the need of fully comprehending the aircraft they are flying. This entails being aware of all the systems, what would happen if they were compromised, and how the aircraft would respond differently while flying at high altitude as opposed to low altitude. Finally, don't forget to keep flying the plane. In the event of a startle, bear in mind that pitch and power will keep you safe and the aircraft in flight. Only then should you attempt to determine what has really occurred. Thanks for hanging out. If you liked this, hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe for more awesome content. Keep the good vibes going. Check out our next video right here, or dive into more with the playlist below. See you soon.